Hello and good evening all. This is one of the constituent component videos of the 5 cars that barely got off the ground compilation, posted for data analysis purposes to determine which car will get a deep dive video in the future. For those of you wondering which video performed best out of all the 5 cars that never got off the ground videos, it was, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Ford J car, and I think that for that, I'm actually going to start working on a larger overview of the GT40 and its many variants, as I think the J car requires more context than some of the other vehicles mentioned in that video. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy. And speaking tangentially of LMP1 being hard, of Nissan with the Delta Wing, and the theme of underdevelopment, let's continue in the WEC and LMP1 and talk about a car that I had immensely high hopes for, the Nissan GT-R LM Nismo. Coming into the mid-2010s, there seemed to be chinks in the Audimantian armor of diesel's power at Le Mans. Despite victories in the first 2 races of the 2015 season for their new version of the R18, Toyota and Porsche were both getting faster year over year, and the FIA's ever-changing regulations were diminishing the efficiency benefits of the fuel over petrol engines. As a result, other manufacturers were eyeing the WEC with more interest than they had for some years, because where 2 might succeed, so too might others. And Nissan decided to toss their hat into the very expensive end of what had become a really expensive pool no matter how you slice it, with their first serious prototype since the R390 in 1997. Discussion of the R391 as another what might have been is a subject for a different time, the Delta Wing of course already having been covered, and representing a whole other, arguably even weirder sidebar. Nevertheless, Nissan called in Ben Bowlby, apparently having enjoyed his previous radical design work on what became the Delta Wing and the Ziad RC, not that they were related or similar, gave him a remit to go arguably even crazier and design a full-fat hybrid LMP1 that could compete with the other major manufacturers, but unlike them, and I quote, wasn't an Audi copy. Given that effectively every LMP1 since the start of the class had in most ways, shapes, and forms shared essentially all of their fundamental design features, apart from the early period where single or double roll hoops were still a matter of debate, and then the interstitial years while everyone migrated to closed cockpits, to so actively say, go do something even crazier than the Delta Wing, here's a bunch of money, was again pushing Bowlby to fly in the face of convention in new and exciting ways. And fly he did, pun partially intended. Pretty much every car discussed on this channel has been either front or mid-engined and rear or all-wheel drive, because essentially that's how you design cars that handle well. What Bowlby did, on the other hand, was build only the second front-engined LMP1, following the Panoz LMP1, but that was a rehash of the old GT1, and then he went even crazier and made the front-engined car front-wheel drive. So basically it was a giant Golf GTI, except not in any way whatsoever. Anyway, this seeming nonsense was prompted by an idea that, as everyone else had been building mid-engined cars for the better part of a decade and a half, the regulations for front aero would be comparatively relaxed relative to the strict regulations on rear aero and downforce, consequently facilitating greater downforce generation without as much drag, which does make a certain amount of sense. However, what Bowlby actually did was basically design a conventional prototype with its bodywork on backwards. If you take all the carbon fiber bodywork off, you reveal the expected carbon monocoque, but the front tires are wider than the rears, with the rears measuring 9 inches versus the front's 14s. The engine is mid-front mounted to the front of the footbox, and the gearbox is mounted right in the nose, which is essentially the same format as if you'd had a defrocked standard LMP1 looking in the mirror. Nissan thought they'd been very clever for this, and in designing the carbon tub to resemble a boat hull, this was facilitated by the radical layout and a reportedly very cramped cockpit that put a strict height and breadth limit on potential drivers, they thought they'd been even cleverer. The engine's power plant was a Cosworth-designed and Nissan-fettled 3-liter twin-turbo V6 that produced about 550 horsepower, and since it was the late LMP1 era, They of course fitted a hybrid system. Nissan chose to use a KERS system in the 8 megajoule output bracket, similar in principle to the Audi R18, but harvesting much greater amounts of electrical energy from the brakes. For those who don't remember or are unaware, Audi at the time was running in the 2 megajoule bracket. This energy was stored in 2 flywheels, which actually would make it kinetic energy, not electrical energy. Anyway, up to 700 horsepower could be deployed exiting a corner or when attempting to overtake, but to either the front or rear wheels, so it was occasionally all-wheel drive, but in a very different way than the Audi or other LMP1s were. For those of you keeping score at home, yes, that's 1,250 horsepower, and given that a lot of that is hybrid horsepowers, you probably got a relatively world-stopping number of torques. Engine power went through an X-Track 5-speed sequential to the front wheels, while the stored flywheel energy could go either to the rear wheels by a secondary drive shaft, limited slip differential, and epicyclic gearboxes on each wheel, or to the fronts through the primary drive shaft traveling over the front of the engine, as the flywheels were located under the driver's legs. Suspension was multi-link wishbones and adjustable dampers. Braking came from 6-pot fronts and 4-pot rears, I believe from Brembo with carbon discs. Tires were, of course, from Michelin, and even if Le Mans didn't go particularly well in its debut year, which nobody really expected it to given the caliber of the competition and the car's radical departures from the norm, Nissan seemed committed to the effort for the long haul. Despite missing the first 2 rounds of the World Endurance Championship, due in part to additional FIA-mandated crash testing, 3 cars were prepared for Le Mans, featuring experienced hands like Harry Tincknell, Max Chilton, and Olivier Pla. However, in something of a theme with this video, the wheels fell off pretty much immediately. The trio of cars qualified last among all LMP1s, behind even the Privateer Rebellion and Bicolis machines, and they were more than 20 seconds off the pace of the pole-sitting Porsche 919. The slowest was a further 2 seconds in arrears behind the KCMG LMP2, which took pole for its class, but these were still dramatic improvements from the test day earlier in the year, which tells you how much ground they had yet to make up. Then, the number 23 missed the start, as it had busted its clutch, and eventually joined, but many laps down the racing order. The number 21 was the first of the 3 cars to retire, after 115 laps, so at least they managed better than the Astons of a few years prior, with suspension failure at Arnage that set a tire loose and left the car unable to keep racing. Another, unrelated tire dropped the number 22 from the running order when the car found it wandering about the Mulsanne Straight and seriously damaged its front bodywork. By morning, it was the number 23 car's turn to give up the ghost, with a blown gearbox leading to its retirement after 234 laps, and the lone number 22 soldiered on and did manage to cross the finish line when the checkered flag flew, but it was so far down the running order that it was unclassified for having completed an insufficient race distance. Leaving this substantial and very expensive debacle, Nissan spent a few months gathering their thoughts and started to test again at Nola Motorsports Park at the end of the year, with an improved car reportedly under development for 2016, but instead they unexpectedly canceled the program and repurposed their resources elsewhere. To my knowledge, they haven't sent the cars out since for any on-track time, although I may have missed a Goodwood appearance or 2 between 2016 and now. 1 car, or a mock-up of it, was outside the Le Mans Museum in 2023, but as it was in a big glass box, I couldn't be 100% sure whether or not it was a mock-up or one of the race-run cars.